Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Lynette Zang. Lynette is the Chief Market Analyst at ITM Trading. That's itmtrading.com. And I am very happy and honored to have Lynette back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Lynette, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Well, thank you. And I'm honored to be here too, Dave. Thank you very much.
That's very nice. You know what? Let's start off with what is happening in the mainstream media. I mean, all I hear and every place I look, I see housing crisis. I see recession in 2020, inverted yield curve. Everything's pointing to something ominous that's about to happen here. With all your research and everything that you've been looking at, I mean, are we headed into a recession?
We have already begun. Main Street never really pulled out of the crisis that happened in 2008. But, when you talk about mainstream media and you talk about the inverted yield curve, these guys talk out of both sides of their mouth because they keep saying, and if the yield curve inverts, and then the next sentence they show you how indeed the yield curve has inverted. And in fact, it inverted in China. Their yield curve inverted in May of 2017. And in the EU, they are very near, if they haven't already gone into an inverted yield curve. So this is happening on a global basis, not just in one country or another. And we're all together in this mess. I'm very nervous, to be perfectly honest with you. I'm very nervous about what I'm seeing.
You mentioned the yield curve, and the Fed a little while ago came out and said, the yield curve is really not that important. When it inverts, it doesn't really mean that we're going to be heading into a recession. So, I mean, are they right? Or are they trying to, direct everyone to look over here instead of over here?
You got it. Because other reports that they have conducted and studies that they have conducted show that every time a yield curve inverts, you end up with a recession. Because what that is, just for people that aren't familiar and they're kind of hearing about the yield curve inversion, the short-term rates are higher than the longer-term rates on debt. And when you stop and think about it, interest rates are supposed to be an indication of the value of money. So if you have money right now, those rates should be the shortest. If you loan it out, you get it back quickly. The longer that you're willing to hold that debt or fund that debt, the more you're supposed to get paid for it. So when you have short-term rates higher than your intermediate and long-term rates, what does that tell you about the value of the money that you get back down the road? It's not worth even marginally as much. So it's a very big deal. And according to their own research, it always foretells a recession, but they don't want you to get prepared for that.
Now, what's very confusing to many people, Trump is out there saying, oh, look at GDP, look at the unemployment rate, very low. He's saying that the economy is doing very well. And then you have, on the other hand, the mainstream media saying that we're heading into a housing crisis, we're heading into a recession. So we have both sides here on opposite ends telling us two different things about the economy.
Well, that's why I like data. Because anybody can blah, 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 say anything that they want. That's why in my work, I always show you why I'm saying what I'm saying. And so when I'm looking at the data, the housing actually, the housing crisis started to unravel in 2016. It has now escalated, but the price movement peaked in March of 2018. So there were already cracks in 2016. And I think maybe 6 or 8 months ago, I did a video showing how the low end was being squeezed, but also the upper end was also being squeezed. You have China that was up until the crackdown, the beginning of this year or the end of last year, whenever that started. You had them as huge buyers of U.S. real estate, And the government cracked down on that because the funds were trying to flee China. And they cracked down on it, Ambang and all those guys. And so they've been selling off all of that real estate that they paid top dollar for. So no, residential, they are counting on the first time. I mean, I have all the proof of this. They're counting on the first time home buyers to support the real estate market, which is 20% of the GDP when you take into account all the peripheral issues that real estate funds. So 20% of GDP, and it peaked out. It started the decline in 2016, and the pricing started to peak out in March of this year. And you've got a lot more selling pressure coming into this market with real estate and a lot more negative data. No, we're in a bear market. Though I will say, if you look at the real estate ETF, so Wall Street derivative product, that the reality of that price does not reflect the reality of what's happening underneath. You know, you've got all of these store closures that are happening, you know, brick and mortar. I mean, come on, please. Who is stupid? You can look in your neighborhood, you can see.
So is this, I mean, when we talk about this recession, is this just a correction, a small recession, or is this the transition? Is this the big one?
This is the big one. And I'm getting goosebumps, and there's not one doubt in my mind, because there's been so much debt that's been accumulated at this zero, you know, money for free interest rates. And a lot of that debt is rolling over. But we also, you know, they keep calling for recession in 2020, which is ridiculous because it's already unfolding. But the reason why it's 2020 is because you've got trillions of dollars in derivative contracts that have to reset from being attached to LIBOR to being attached to whatever they come up with. And they're all working on coming up with stuff, but it doesn't have a fixed market that it can go into. And even if everything moves absolutely perfectly, it's the value of those contracts that will change no matter what, which changes the value, or the valuation rather, I should say, of all of the holders of those contracts. So all the financial institutions, the shadow banks, which are banks that do a lot of functions of banking, but they don't have deposits to bail in. So whether it's banks or it's shadow banks. So no, we are inside that transition, and it's a big one because central banks, even Janet Yellen, I love how these guys get out of office and then they admit things, you know, but even Janet Yellen says that we're going into this next crisis with very limited central banks tools, and that is absolutely true globally.
And I just want to say, I mean, we've been discussing, you know, a recession, collapse, and in our previous interviews that we've done, this is not something that's new. It just didn't come up yesterday. This was brewing since, you know, right after 2008.
Yes.
So we're in this illusion here. We've been in an illusion, and they've been propping the economy up since that time period. So yes, this is just the end part of it right now.
Exactly. You are spot on correct. And that's the thing. They kept it propped up to transfer the risk from the corporations, the few, to the public, the many. And they have a lot of tools, or they've had a lot of tools to do that with. In fact, interestingly enough, you know, I just told you how if you look at the real estate ETF, that's going up as the real estate market is declining.
Right.
But Toll Brothers in there is not behaving. Their stock is not behaving well at all. And I just did this little digging, and what I discovered, very interesting. And it really is the way that they transfer risk. And that is that the insiders, Robert Toll, who is the executive, the overall executive of Toll Brothers, has been selling his shares of stock like crazy. And so who's been buying it? Yeah, the stock keeps going down, but who's been buying it? Oh, guess what? It's institutional investors, which are Wall Street that invests your money. And so here you know that it's in a negative market. These guys aren't stupid. They know this. And yet they're going in the institutions. So your 401k, your 403b, your IRA, any mutual funds, ETFs, variable annuities, all of these different plans, pension plans are turning it around and buying this garbage just like they're doing with the off the road, the secondary market treasuries. Nobody will buy there. There are no buyers there. So they put them in pension plans and IRAs and 401ks, and they transfer the risk. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it. That's one way. If you haven't seen that one yet, I'm actually doing it like shortly after we finish filming this, but you want to take a look at how they can invisibly transfer that risk. And see, the thing is, I've been saying this right along because it's just a fact. When enough risk has been transferred to the public, bailing out the system will become too expensive. And when you look at all of these bombs that are being lobbed at the global system right now, I'm really thinking that enough risk has been transferred and they are ready for the next crisis. I don't know if they're fully ready, but I think they're ushering it in. I don't think they're ready for it, but they're ushering it in.
We talk about the central bank and how, they know what's going on. They've been planning this. Now, what's funny about this is that we haven't had many presidents contradicting the Fed, but Trump contradicted the Fed, talked about the interest rates, also blamed them. If the economy comes down, it's your fault. We've never, I don't remember, maybe Kennedy or Reagan was the last two presidents that actually went out and contradicted the Fed. And he's purposely pointing the finger. I think he knows that the Fed is responsible for all of this. Do you think he's going to be going after the Fed, after the central bank?
I think what is most likely to happen, which is pretty typical during these periods of time, is that the government ends up taking over the central bank. And there have been slight repositionings in that regard since, I believe, 2009. So the Fed is not, in my opinion, is not as independent. But even if they were, they are a flippin' private bank. And how do banks generate money? And what is really their job? Their job is to protect the banking system. But the problem is yes, I'm fairly certain at some point during this crisis, he can't do it now, but during this next crisis, that the Fed it'll be obvious that the Fed is supporting government policy, just like it is in many of the other hyperinflationary countries that we're looking at. Venezuela, India is battling right now, but, probably it'll succumb as well. But there are a lot of countries that are dealing with that, and it really won't be a good thing. It's not a good thing whether they're part of it or not part of it. But it won't be a good thing when that happens. It's just an indication we've ratcheted up to the next level.
It's very interesting. You mentioned independence, and there was an article about the central banks where they're very worried about governments and the people questioning their independence. And at this point right now, they're really looking out and seeing. We're seeing what's happening in France and everywhere else. So I'm sure they're very worried because all eyes, I think, right now are on the central banks if the entire global system comes down. They don't have an event to cover it up at this point. So what do?
Well, hyperinflate, because, let's see, when these markets all implode, that's deflationary, right? That pushes prices down. That's deflationary. Right. There's only one way. One, not two, not 15, one, and that's with inflation, but their balance sheets are so bloated. What are you going to do? More QE? Yeah. But is it going to be effective? No, because they have no place to go with interest rates, but more negative. I mean, this is endgame. I'm sorry, but it is.
You mentioned inflation, and back when we came off the gold standard back in 1971 officially, we saw inflation then. I mean, they were printing a lot of currency. People's wages went up. I remember my father back in the 70s, all of a sudden he was making $5,000 and he was making then $10,000. Housing prices went up. Everything went up. But that was during a period of when we had very little debt. Interest rates were very high. Now we're on the complete opposite side. Interest rates are very, very, very low. Wages not that high. And we have a huge amount of debt. If we get hit with inflation this time, how different is that going to look?
Well, that's the whole point. It'll look like, that was close to hyperinflation during that period. That was a transition off the gold standard. Now we're in another transitionary period. So that inflation will be the hyperinflation that will burn out whatever little bit of confidence people still, because it's the public that has the confidence in the currencies. It's not the banks or the central banks. They know the truth. It is still the public. And when you're talking about the central bank money, it is all about confidence in that entity as to whether or not they can remain in power. And this whole rise of populism, which President Trump is part of that populist movement, that is what threatens their power. It's not just their autonomy, it's their power, because whoever creates the money creates the rules.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. People have been talking about the transition.
Yeah.
We talked about this before.
Yeah.
Is this going to be like a Mad Max type of scenario, or do you think there's safeguards in place for when the system come down? We saw it back in 2008 when it came down. People were shocked. People didn't know what was happening. Right. Everyone was like, wow, the economy was doing great, and all of a sudden it came down. This time around, how is it going to look for people? Are people going to be shocked? Is it going to be that shocking?
Of course, it's always shocking to the public that is not paying attention, because this is not something that lies ahead of us. It is something we are already walking through, but we have blinders on. It's that normalcy bias. This can't possibly happen in the face of it happening. So it will be shocking because right now, when you look at the stock market, we've been taught that reflects what's happening with the economy, but everybody should know that particularly since 2008, the stock market does not reflect Main Street. It reflects Wall Street. And it's been pushed up through all sorts of financial engineering. But it's also been coming down just because of its own weight. There, up until this point, has not been an influx of sellers. And that's the difference. That I just saw this, like when I was doing some work yesterday, actually, that the selling pressure appears to be increasing. So what's going to be shocking, number one, we're already seeing more flash crashes. A week ago, Tuesday, so not this past Tuesday, but the one before, when the markets went down 800 points, the CME halted trading over 40 times. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that. Wow.
Exactly. Over 40 flipping times. These products are contracts. And in these contracts, they give them the ability to do anything they want. And this was happening without a massive selling. So what's going to happen when people get their statements, their quarterly statements, and they open it up and it doesn't look so great, and they start to sell? Because the end of November, November 28th, they had don't hold me to this number, but it was something like 635 billion outflows from ETFs. Now, keep in mind that ETFs are exchange traded funds. They are a derivative product, and the rise of the ETF was concurrent with the demise of the CDO derivatives. Okay, so they have not fully been tested. They have not been tested through a crisis. This is our next test, is what's happening with the ETFs. But because they do not have to pay out in cash, they have been granted a waiver. That's why most ETFs hold virtually no cash for redemptions, because they redeem in kind. In other words, they can create new shares, new ETFs, and think about how ETFs are created. They're created via demand. So people want to buy this special ETF. Okay, they make as many of those ETF shares as they want to. And then when people start to sell, that's how those shares are destroyed. Now, only authorized participants can redeem the shares. So you and I would not be an authorized participant. If you bought a share of any ETF, you are not an authorized participant. That's guys like JP Morgan and Wells Fargo and Merrill Lynch. Those guys, that's who the authorized participants are. So with all of those outflows, with all of those ETFs having been sold, then JP Morgan or whoever the particular authorized participant is on that ETF, they either got shares of a new ETF or they got shares in the underlying index, or however they're being paid out. Chances are pretty good at the moment they're sitting on those excess shares. But what happens when they're forced to sell, when there's enough liquidations? So what's going to shock people, going back to your original question, is their inability to liquidate when that knife, the stock market knife, is falling. Trading will be halted. It's going to impact the banks, so all of the bail-ins will take place. Yeah, it's going to shock everybody because they don't see the underlying mechanisms. But we're all globally interconnected, so it doesn't really matter where the weak link is in that system. And Deutsche Bank and Commerce Bank may be merging. Thank you. Okay. It doesn't really matter where the weak link is. It will be shocking in the speed because people do not understand that these markets are not liquid. If a lot of people want to sell at one time, you are not getting out.
So, I mean, if this does happen, you said, the banks would close because of the bail. Because you mentioned bail-ins, so I'm assuming the banks would then close for. Well,
do you realize that last Wednesday, after Tuesday's bloodbath, when the markets were surprisingly closed, and the excuse was President Bush's funeral, but that was not a planned event. That was a surprise event in an attempt to calm the markets. So we just had a Wall Street holiday, even though that's not how they didn't spin it that way. But that is a fact. They were trying to calm these insane markets.
Are you saying that they used the funeral to close the markets?
That is exactly what I am saying. Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. Look at all those trading halts. Look at all the volatility on these markets. And that was a surprise event. That was not a planned event. And do you ever recall them doing that?
No.
Thank you.
So you mentioned bail-ins, and we just saw the banks close down for this. And of course, people, even myself, were not thinking in this way.
Exactly.
Right. So they'll probably come up with another excuse when all this starts to happen.
Of course.
And you said bail-ins. You didn't say bailouts. So the bail-in documentation, that is still on the table right now, where the bank is going to go inside and take what they need.
Oh, my goodness. Yes, indeed. In fact, you even get, if you're a bank, having bail-inable. Oh, my gosh, yes. Actually, since 2008, bank deposits funded about, don't hold me to this, but I'll be pretty close, about 25% of the bank's trading activities. Since the bail-in, deposits fund 48% of the bank's trading activities. So they have been working quite diligently. And look at all of the Wall Street banks that became banks, so they would have access to the Fed window. I mean, that didn't go away. Goldman Sachs has been working voraciously on, and they all have, on building their depositor base, just because it is much easier to bail this in, because deposits from normal people like you and me are classified as sticky. They are not likely to run. And if you don't run in time, you ain't getting out anyway. Look at Cyprus, look at Greece, look at Portugal, look at Ireland, look at Poland, look at England, look at Austria. I mean, the list goes on since the crisis. None of that went away. That showed you what it's going to look like, but worse.
You said something very interesting, and it just clicked with me, where you said these banks like Goldman Sachs and others became banks where they had access to the Fed window. They can take deposits in. And if you really go back in time now, it's like they actually planned for all of this. I mean, now I'm thinking about it. Now you can see, now, of course, it's easier to go from this point and look backwards than looking at the time, where all the, Goldman Sachs and others were becoming banks and they were taking depositors. Then they came up with the bail-in documents. Now, when you look back, you can see the progression and how they maneuvered their way into this position where they're able to protect themselves from the next crash. It's completely amazing.
Yes. And you know what Janet Yellen is worried about? The leverage loans. Corporations are leveraged as high as or higher than they have ever been. And since 2008, when interest rates were pushed all the way down to zero, and there was this reach for yield, people were trying to get more yield. They were not paying attention. So you have this massive rise of what they call covenant light. That means protections from whoever is loaning that money, because that's what you're doing when you're buying a bond or a leveraged loan or any of that. You're loaning that money, which means the protections for those people that are loaning that money, whether it's in your pension or your 401k or wherever it is that you're doing it, whether you realize it or not, you don't have any protections. Well, I can't say any. You don't have many protections. And that is the area that has grown massively. So, yes, I did a study years ago on the laws on the books pertaining to gold and gold ownership and confiscation and all of that. And I started from today, whenever I did that day, and I moved backwards. And you made such an interesting comment, Dave, because it's absolutely true, is with some hindsight, you can see, that a lot of these crises were planned to move an agenda forward. Absolutely, 100%. And I'm not really that much of a skeptical person by nature. I'm definitely an optimist, and I generally think that most people really want to do the best job that they can. They want to be a good person. But boy, when you look at this just like you did, and you see that pattern of lies and deceits and risk transfer, right? I mean, there are so many different ways. It's all of the legacy garbage derivatives that cannot settle, that were moved onto the balance sheets of the central banks, on which you and I as taxpayers are responsible.
Yes.
It's all of the wave of insiders selling out, while those pension plans and, all those money managers. I mean, I hate to even call them that, because I'm too much of a lady to tell you what I really think of them on air. Okay.
Okay. You mentioned gold, and we're talking about all of this happening, recession, China, Russia, as we've said many, many times before, they've been accumulating a lot of gold. Many other countries are repatriating their gold. With the U.S. right now, Many people think the U.S. has no gold. Other people saying the U.S. does have gold. Is gold going to be something that is used in the next system?
Well, look, there are things that are way beyond my control. But what I can tell you is this. Historically, yes, because there is 100% of the time demand across the entire economy for gold, whether it's in manufacturing, it's in the financial system, it's in art, it's in food, it's everywhere. So there is always demand, and silver as well. For physical metals, there are traits that they possess that they have never been able to duplicate. So, and plus with gold, it's indestructible. So the answer is yes. Plus, what we've seen in the third quarter of 2018 is that year over year central bank buying is up. I think I could be off a little bit. Obviously, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was up like 28%. What's so significant back to levels in 2015 as the peg, the currency peg system first began to break down, the current one. But what's really significant about that are the number of new central banks that are starting to accumulate gold, not just the Russias and Chinas and Indias, but a lot of new central banks that were not accumulating gold are now accumulating gold. Why would they do that?
I was just going to ask you that.
If it's so worthless.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, why would they even hold gold? Because they've been telling us that it's a barbarous relic. They've been telling us it's not money. Why would they even hold it? Just to have the shiny object? It makes no sense.
Exactly.
And the only... Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No, the only reason they would do it is if they know that something's going to happen. They know that their paper system is going to collapse.
Exactly. And what they also know is that is how. Again, when you have one choice, it's kind of easy to anticipate what that outcome is. And that is how a financial system, a currency system is reset. It's against gold. So whoever holds the gold is actually holding and protecting for a central bank, their power. Keep in mind what the IMF is the third largest holder of gold that everybody donated to them, including the U.S. There's a very significant, so yes, part of what happens through a hyperinflationary event, and this is going to be a global hyperinflationary event, is complete loss of confidence, the public's complete loss of confidence in the system. So that means that they're going to have to do something to regain that confidence. And the something that they always do, including in this country, I have the link to the fireside chat by Roosevelt, is they back the currency, at least partially, with gold to create that stabilization. So, central banks are buying gold hand over fist, but they don't want you to, because that is not a contract-based product that is out of the system, and it has 100% global demand, maybe sometimes a little more, sometimes less, depending upon the current economy, but 100% there is always demand.
Do you think countries will ask the IMF for their gold back?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I don't know, because I think that what's happening is that the IMF will be the umbrella currency. The SDR, their internal currency, is most likely to be that internal currency. And then all other currencies would become local. The US dollar only good here, the Chinese yuan only good in China, etc. So, and the IMF has discussed putting a component of gold into that SDR basket. So I don't really think it's likely that countries would ask the IMF for their gold back, because they're not holding it for them. That was given to them as part of the agreement to be part of the IMF.
Okay. So if you're saying that we're going to be moving into this SDR and each country will have their local currency,
Yeah.
is this going to be a central bank currency where it's a paper that is attached to debt? Because right now we have the Federal Reserve note. It's a debt note.
Right. I don't think so, because the problem is we're at the end of that debt cycle. So either into the new system, they have to wipe all this debt clean so they can start and grow a whole lot more debt, which is certainly a possibility. But, even easier than doing that would really just go into a Fed coin. I think we'll always have a US dollar coin in this country, because as long as you keep the name, people don't realize that everything has changed. So I'm betting that there's going to be a US dollar coin, but it'll still be controlled. And if they can get everything completely intangible, so not even that paper, then it is much easier to control any monetary policy. Because right now, if the central bank is trying to generate inflation or whatever they're trying to do, they put in place a policy, but it takes 18 months-ish for them to know if that policy had impact. Whereas if they want you to spend, they don't want you to hold your money in the bank, then all they do is charge negative rates deeply enough that you watch your principal eroding. And rather than just sit there and watch it erode for nothing, then people will have more of a tendency to go out and buy something, convert it into anything that has or may have the ability to hold its value. Because obviously in a negative interest rate environment, it attacks your principal. So, and that's instantaneous. You're not spending fast enough. Good. We'll just push interest rates down deeper. So that's what they want. But there's still too many cash transactions in this country as well as globally for them to completely easily do it. They have the plan in place to make that happen, to convert to a digital currency without having to pull cash out of the system. So kind of alerting you what their intention is. And they say, and I saw it, so I believe this, that they can have it in place within weeks during the next crisis. You can find that information. You can call us and we'll send you the link. But over at the IMF, it's called Breaking Below the Lower Zero Bound. That's the blueprint of how they intend to do it. It's genius. Just like all this other inflation, all this other stuff is. It's genius. But it's evil genius, and it's not okay with me personally.
So, I mean, for all on a local basis, like here in the United States, in the beginning, we talked about maybe the Fed will be taken over. Will the Fed, if it is taken over, will it create currency out of thin air, or will there be gold that is backed, where this currency is backed by gold and they just can't create it with interest?
Well, a number of things could happen, but number one is I've heard a lot of people have asked me or told me that China's planning on backing their currency with gold, or we could back our currency with gold. Here's the thing about that. First, they would have to burn off the current debt, because as soon as you back a currency with gold, it fixes whatever the garbage is. It's fixed right at that moment. That's why they can't take all of this unpayable debt that we're currently at and just move it over into a new system. We have to get rid of it. And that's what the transition from the LIBOR is about, because they have to reset all of those contracts. So we need a total financial system reset. So yeah, the next system could be blatantly out of thin air, or it could be, if it's a cryptocurrency, it could be a transaction-based creation, right? In other words, every time you use it, that's how you create it. Just like in the current system, every time you took on debt, you created money. So I don't know exactly yet, because I haven't been able, I haven't come across anything that has told me, they have all of the bugs worked out. But in a cryptocurrency circumstance, that it is more likely that we're moving into a transaction-based money instead of a debt-based money. Gold is a labor-based, savings-based money. So yeah, they'll anchor it after they've gotten rid of all the garbage for a minute or two until we get lulled into that false sense of security, and then the game will start again. At least that's what history tells us, and I think that's the most likely outcome.
So what do you see happening moving forward next year? I mean, do you think they'll also raise rates next year? And
I think the system is going to implode before they have the ability to do it too many more times. From the data that I'm seeing, I'm going to tell everybody right now, pay attention to the volume on these exchanges, because that is really the big key here. The volatility, because there is such a narrow base of buyer in these markets, you can create a lot of volatility with just a little bit of volume. In other words, buying and selling. But what happens when that selling increases to that volatility, it takes it to the extreme levels and everything will be shut down. And I think we'll see that next year. If we don't see that before the end of this year, I hope we don't see it before the end of this year. We're middle December. I'm hoping we can make it the next 2 weeks. I guess we can, but I think we'll see that next year. Okay. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think so.
Lynette, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see all your work?
ITM Trading on YouTube. They can Google my name, Lynette Zang. We really are all about, I created a strategy since 1987 is when I started studying currencies. So we're all about helping people plan for this, because planning, failing to plan is planning to fail. And, central bankers and corporations clearly have a plan. Individuals need a plan too. So they could call us at 888-696-4653. If you're working with them, you're working with me. We're all trained in this. We all pay attention to this. And that's how they can find us.
Great. Lynette, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you know what? There is one more thing I'd like to say. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I almost forgot. But because we have a special event that's planned, and the second weekend in February, it's a whole weekend workshop. So for accredited investors, they would come into town. We're just doing it in a very, very small group so that you get a lot of one-on-one. And the whole goal of that workshop is to help people identify and create their own plan that they can execute. And I'm really excited about the event. It's the most comprehensive one. I've done it on the strategy yet. And I'm doing it because that's where we are in the trend cycle. We need to have a plan, people, please.
How do people find out about the event? Where should they go for that?
They can go to www.itmtradingevents.com. And they can get all the information on it, or again, they can give us a call at 888-696-4653, and any precious metals consultant can help them get that information. But it's good. It's a critical event, so I think it's important.
Great. Lynette, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Dave. Anytime. I love our conversation.
Yes, so do I.